Was standing in a hospital hallway holding a coffee he couldn't drink outside a room he hadn't known existed. It started with a voicemail. He'd been in back-to-back meetings all morning, phone face down on his desk the way Claire always asked him not to do, because what if something happens and I can't reach you? When he finally flipped it over, there were 6 missed calls, 3 from a number he didn't recognize, 2 from Claire's mother Diane, who hadn't spoken more than 12 words to Nathan in 2 years, not since the wedding, and 1 from Claire herself, timestamped 7:43 a.m. that just said, "Nathan, call me back when you get this, okay? I love you." He listened to the unknown voicemail first. "Mr. Cole, this is Memorial General Hospital calling regarding your wife Claire Cole. She was brought in this morning. She has you listed as her emergency contact. If you could please call or come to the main desk as soon as possible. She's stable." But Nathan didn't hear the rest. He was already grabbing his keys. The drive took 22 minutes. He spent 19 of them telling himself it was a car accident, something small, something explainable, not the other thing his brain kept suggesting, the thing he kept pushing back down. She was in room 114 with a broken wrist, 2 cracked ribs and a concussion. The nurse told him she'd been brought in by a colleague, a man named James, who had stayed until noon and then quietly left when he heard the husband was on his way. Something about the way she said the husband made the back of Nathan's neck go cold. Claire had been at a medical conference in Seattle. Nathan had dropped her off at the airport himself 4 days ago, kissed her at the curb, watched her disappear through the sliding doors with her rolling carry-on and her easy smile. But the hospital was not in Seattle. The hospital was 40 minutes from their house. And the conference didn't end until Thursday. It was Wednesday. So where had she been last night? She was asleep when he reached her room, and he sat in the chair beside her bed and held her hand and looked at the woman he'd married 6 years ago and tried to make the pieces fit. They didn't fit. Claire's mother Diane arrived at 7 and they sat on opposite sides of the room in the specific silence of 2 people who'd run out of neutral topics years ago. When Diane finally left, she paused at the door. She looked at Nathan with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something complicated, something that almost looked like guilt. "Take care of her," she said. "Not take care of yourself. Take care of her." Like she was asking him to do something she already knew was going to be hard. Nathan drove home alone that night. Sat in the driveway of the house they'd bought together and opened the shared location app on his phone. They'd turned it on 2 years ago after Claire's car broke down, and it had felt like safety then. Now it felt like a door. He opened it anyway. Tuesday night, Claire's phone had been in a residential neighborhood in Tacoma, 43 minutes from their house, not a hotel, not a conference venue, a street with houses and driveways and people who lived there. He searched the address. A craftsman-style home owned by a man named Patrick Holloway. He Googled Patrick Holloway. Dr. Patrick Holloway. Oncologist. Memorial General Hospital. The same hospital Claire was lying in right now. Nathan set his phone down on the passenger seat and stared at the garage door for a long time. Here is what he did not do. He did not go back to the hospital at midnight and demand answers from a woman with a concussion and 2 cracked ribs. What he did instead was something his father had told him once. The man who swings first loses the argument every time. So he waited. Claire was discharged after 3 days. She couldn't drive, couldn't lift anything heavier than her coffee mug, needed help washing her hair, and Nathan did all of it quietly and gently and without asking the question that was taking up all the space in his chest. She slept a lot. He cooked things she didn't eat. She said thank you every time he brought her something, and the thank yous felt like a language he didn't speak anymore. 2 weeks after she came home, he sat across from a man named Dennis in an office above a dry cleaner in Federal Way. Dennis operated a small private investigation firm and smelled of burned coffee and competence. Nathan told him everything. The conference, the hospital, the address, the name. Dennis listened without expression. Then he said, "How long have you been married?" 6 years. "Do you want to know the truth?" Nathan thought about that carefully because it was not a simple question. "I want all of it," he said, "not just the worst of it." Dennis nodded like he understood the difference. The first call came 4 days later. The conference was real. Dennis confirmed that first Claire had attended all 3 days, presented a paper on Thursday morning. He had the program, the registration, the lanyard photo to prove it. She'd left a day early. Driven home Wednesday night. And spent Tuesday and Wednesday evening at the Craftsman on the residential street in Tacoma. 2 evenings. The financials were clean, no unusual charges, no second phone that Dennis could find. But he found something else. Something Nathan hadn't asked him to look for. A medical billing statement forwarded to the Craftsman address from an oncology practice downtown. Dennis slid it across the desk with the careful movements of someone who understood the weight of what he was handing over. "I can't tell you what it means," he said quietly, "only she can, but you should see it." Nathan drove home. Sat in the driveway again. This was becoming a habit. He went inside. Claire was on the couch watching something she wasn't really watching the way she'd been doing since the accident, just existing in front of a screen, eyes somewhere else entirely. He sat beside her. She glanced over. "Hey. Hey." He looked at her. Really looked. The shadows under her eyes, that weren't new but were deeper than they'd been a year ago, the weight she'd lost since spring that he'd called stress, the way she held herself slightly curled like she was protecting something. "Claire." "Yeah." He didn't know how to begin, so he began with what he knew. "I know you were at Patrick Holloway's house." The remote slipped from her hand. She didn't reach for it. The silence lasted long enough that he could hear the refrigerator humming. "How?" she finally said. "Does it matter?" She closed her eyes. "No, I suppose not." He waited. She pressed her fingers to her mouth, and when she spoke, her voice was the voice of someone who had been carrying something so heavy for so long that being asked to set it down felt almost like grief. "Patrick is my oncologist," she said. The room tilted. "We went to college together, lost touch, and then 18 months ago I came to see him and he referred me to his colleague, but he stayed involved because he's a friend, Nathan. He's been a friend through all of this, and I've been going to his house for some appointments because his colleague's office is in the same building as your firm, and I didn't want you to see my car in the parking lot and start asking questions I wasn't ready to answer." Nathan heard himself say 18 months. She nodded. "What kind?" "Breast," she said, "originally stage 2. And now?" She met his eyes. "We think stage 3. The word we. Patrick and her oncologist and her therapist and her mother Diane, who had shown up at that hospital with her guilty complicated face and her careful instruction, take care of her. Everyone had known. Everyone except him. Why, he said, and he could hear that he sounded broken because he was. "Because," she pressed her fists against her eyes, "last year you were so happy, Nathan, you got the promotion, your sister had the baby, things were finally good, and I looked at you and I couldn't be the thing that ended that. I couldn't do that to you. You were trying to protect me. I was trying to." His voice came out unsteady. "You thought keeping me in the dark was protecting me. I thought if you knew you'd fall apart and then I'd have to hold you together on top of everything else, and I didn't have anything left for that." There was a brutal honesty in that. He thought about all the evenings he'd come home talking about work, about deals, about his sister's baby, while somewhere across town his wife was sitting in a doctor's office alone getting news he didn't know existed. He reached over and took her hand. The hand that was thinner than it used to be. That he had called stress. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You don't know what you're signing up for." "Yes, I do," he said. "Tell me everything." So she did. 18 months of appointments and second opinions and a clinical trial Patrick had helped her access, and the good weeks and the terrible weeks and the days she'd driven around for hours because she wasn't ready to come home yet and perform normal. He listened. He didn't say, "Why didn't you trust me?" Not that night. That night he just listened. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is stay in the room when the story gets hard. The weeks that followed were a reckoning in stages. He was angry, and he let himself be angry, not at Claire, not at Patrick, but at the year they'd lost to secrecy, at himself for being a husband whose happiness had apparently looked too fragile to disturb. Their therapist, a woman named Dr. Okafor, who had the specific gift of asking questions that felt like clarity, not accusation, asked Claire why she'd chosen to carry it alone. She asked Nathan whether Claire's fear that he'd fall apart was entirely without foundation. That session was the hardest thing Nathan had ever sat through, and also the most necessary. By spring they had a system. He attended every appointment. She shared her treatment chart on her phone and he had access to it. He took every Tuesday off because Tuesday was often the hardest day, and she let him be scared out loud, and he let her be furious, which she was more furious than he expected, fury at her own body, at the timing, at the uncertainty, and he held that fury carefully because her anger meant she was still fighting. The treatment response was better than expected. The oncologist started using the word encouraging. In August, the scan results made Claire cry in the hospital parking lot with her forehead against the steering wheel, and Nathan held her from the passenger seat and understood that relief and grief can wear the exact same face. They planted the backyard that fall. Finally. A raised bed for vegetables, a tree for the corner they'd debated for years, a small stone bench from which you could see the whole yard. Claire sat on that bench the first evening while Nathan made dinner inside. He watched her through the kitchen window. She was just sitting. Not managing, not performing, not protecting anyone. Just sitting in the early dark with her face turned toward the last of the light. He thought about the men who'd sat in a hospital parking lot 6 months ago certain his marriage was ending and understood something he hadn't then. Sometimes the story you think you're in is not the story you're actually in. Sometimes the secret isn't betrayal. Sometimes it's a person trying to love you the only way they knew how when they were running out of road. The question isn't why didn't you tell me? The question is what do we do now? They were still answering it. Every Tuesday. Every scan result. Every evening in the yard they'd decided to finally believe in.